Okay, and we are live. Hello everybody, and welcome to day 2 of the Technology Driving Transition Global Summit. COP started yesterday, and what a start we had here, but of course there's been a start at COP, the Blue Zone, with a lot of discussion and some positive, hopefully, development, some reason for concern as well. But as I said yesterday, we'll have to live and wait and see what comes out after 2 weeks. And for now, for us here, we're doing our part. And our part is uncovering technology, discussing technology and technology innovation. What is the role of technology innovation in transition, oil and gas traditional basins into net zero energy region? And we had a fantastic day yesterday. And we start our tour around the world, these 10 centers, 11 centers that are come together for this summit. So yesterday we've been in Canada, we've been in the US, and of course we've been in the UK as well. And that's why we started in the afternoon. Today we started in the morning, so that's a hint, and maybe we're going somewhere else. So we're going to have some live presenters here from Brazil that are happen to be here, and they will join us soon, hopefully, and from the UK. But of course, the early start means that we are connecting with Australia, and I'm very keen to hear what comes out of that. But before we kickstart today, I'd like to invite our CEO, Colette Cohen, and share your thoughts about yesterday. What are your key takeaways from yesterday's session?
So Luca asked me this before we came in, and I went from actual COP26, nothing yet, because there was a lot of, not a lot of content yesterday. But actually, I thought in this room and in the discussions we had with the RTOs around the world, that was brilliant. Because I think one of the conversations we've all been having, and we actually had in the taxi with the taxi driver this morning, is anything happening? And what we got from yesterday was how much is already happening. And while we might be all looking at slightly different things, like the brilliant industrial clusters from IDRIC and the work that they're doing, which we're maybe not as aligned with as we would like to be, things, the carbon hub in Rice University, that was just amazing, some of the sort of reuse and what they were doing with carbon. I was left thinking, wow, this is exciting. And the fact that now we're coming together to work together to identify where those technology alignment opportunities are, but also where the technology gaps are and how we might be able to fill them to try and drive this acceleration of net zero. I walked away excited by the opportunity.
Thank you, Colette. Yeah, it is very exciting. And as you said, sometimes we're maybe not too aligned. That's part of the dialogue. Yeah. That's part of uncovering those similarities and differences that we are targeting with this summit. And then working together. But that will come tomorrow with a little bit of surprise on what we do next.
Exactly.
But for now, thank you very much, Colette, and thank you again for being here today in person and online. And I'd like to start with our keynote speaker from today, is Andy Samuel, Chief Executive of the Oil and Gas Authority. And he couldn't be with us today, but he sent us a contribution on video.
Good morning. I'm delighted to be with you today as we start day 2 of the Net Zero Technology Centre's Technology Driving Transition Global Summit. I'm presenting here today as a non-exec director with the Technology Centre and also as the Chief Executive of the UK's Oil and Gas Authority. And it's an absolutely exciting time to be looking at technology and the role it can play in this vital transition. Arguably, society is more concerned than ever and demanding cleaner technology at great pace. This is a feedback loop that I've modified from the World Economic Forum. And you can see it starts with society. The financial markets are indeed reacting and reacting fast. And hopefully this week at COP26, governments around the world are going to do their bit. And then really it's down to the entrepreneurs and technology to really come up with better solutions and at pace. Now, it's not just the climate emergency, of course, that we're concerned about. There's massive loss of biodiversity and growing social inequality. So hopefully technology will be looking to reduce divides and actually play a really vital systemic approach as we go forward. And a lot of this is going to require international collaboration. So over the years, my team and myself have been delighted to work with a range of stakeholders across the globe, and events like today further bring people together as we all look to do our part in this growing crisis. And huge thanks to the Net Zero Technology Centre for facilitating such important events like this a really great step forward. Now, turning a little bit to the UK situation, my organisation kicked off a study back in 2018 when we started looking at how the North Sea could really play a significant part in the overall UK's abatement. And quite quickly we saw that it can indeed provide 60% of the total abatement required out to 2050. A lot of this will come through offshore wind, but also through what we call the energy integration technologies, electrification, CCS, and blue hydrogen. And again, we're finding that this will only be realized through very different levels of collaboration. We did this study jointly with fellow regulators, Ofgem, but also Crown Estate Scotland, and our host department, BEIS. And the really important thing now, though, is this is moving from a vision into a reality, and there's a lot of action underway on all of these technologies and applications with a broad range of investors. So really gathering momentum. Key to underpinning this is a deal that was struck recently called the North Sea Transition Deal. We believe this is very much a first of a kind for a G7 country. It's government, industry, and the regulators working together. It ties in with other parts of government policy and strategy, such as the recent net zero strategy and the future licensing climate compatibility checkpoint. And it's a fair but demanding deal on all sides. Industry have committed to substantial investment, 10 billion on hydrogen, 3 billion on electrification, 3 billion on CCS, and through this, a high proportion of local content and a real focus and recognition of the importance of the supply chain and the service companies in delivering solutions, and of course, the technologists. A large part of the deal is also to drive down emissions. Industry is committed to halving emissions by 2030 and of course becoming net zero by 2050. And my organisation is set up to monitor, we'll support, but we will hold industry to account. We've developed a range of sophisticated benchmarks so we can see year by year that hopefully industry is well on track to achieving this. Now, technology, as I say, will play a vital part. In fact, arguably, some of these targets cannot be met without substantial further innovation. Areas that we're looking for support on are, of course, emissions reduction through the flaring and venting reduction, efficiency, low carbon power. It is vital that a fair proportion of the offshore assets are electrified, as offshore power generation is typically 60 to 70% of the overall emissions. Looking at integration of different technologies such as floating offshore wind to provide lower carbon power generation. Strong links, of course, to hydrogen, both blue and green hydrogen, and a lot of technology to be developed there. And very excitingly, I think in the UK context and globally, carbon capture and storage. And I would suggest wrapping around all of this is the need for more sophisticated ways of integrating and looking at the whole system. So an awful lot to get after, and but a lot of momentum already underway. If we just look, for example, at CCS, so the UK is blessed with more than ample storage capacity, both in depleted reservoirs, but also aquifers. 78 gigatons is the current estimate. If we look at what the Climate Change Committee suggests we need by 2050, 75 to 175 megatons a year. We already have licensed as the OGA 4 very exciting licenses for the projects you can see on the bottom here, which together can easily meet the 6 carbon budget requirements. So well set up, but then a gap starts to grow from 2035 onwards. So we're looking at what is the future licensing pipeline and what is the best way to do this. Now, what we have seen is that the North Sea is becoming increasingly crowded. There are a range of competing technologies requiring sometimes the same aerial space. So spatial planning is becoming more and more vital. And I think this is an area, along with many others, that technology can once again play its part, this time very much through data and digital. Clearly, old technologies like GIS can play a new role for the UK offshore. We've developed an app that brings together all of these different energy systems and licenses so that people can visualize and optimize. We've created our own digital energy platform that has vast amounts of data, along with our new national data repository. This is now open to everyone. It's free and people can visualize the data and then download what they need. And ourselves, along with the Net Zero Technology Centre, many others, are creating more and more insights through this data revolution. And I think this will only accelerate going forward. So I hope this is a helpful food for thought as we start day 2 of this vital summit. Thank you very much again for coming along and joining in virtually as well. And if you have solutions, please don't be shy in coming forward, and let's see what we can create for the future. Good day and thank you.
And thank you very much, Andy, and it is indeed a food for thought. Before we move on, can I ask, please, if we can put the slide with the instruction for the Slido for the questions? That would be helpful both for the people in the room and also for the people online. But a couple of things from Andy Samuel's speech, I think, that resonate very well with what we did yesterday and what we're going to discuss today. One is international collaboration, of course, but then the pace and the need for the role of technology, and also the transformation of the oil and gas industry into something else, or the merger across sectors. And we're going to hear a lot about that from our next speaker, Renee Peters from TNO in the Netherlands. They've been doing a lot of that integration between renewables and gas. So that would be probably certainly a very interesting one. Renee is with us, but it's recorded a message for the sake of the proceeding to make it smoother, but he will be with us in the Q&A later on. Thank you.
Okay, good morning to you all. My name is Renee Peters. I'm with TNO, Applied Research Organization in the Netherlands. And I would like to talk about the unlocking of the potential of the North Sea, where we are using offshore system integration to accelerate the energy transition. Coming from the Netherlands, it must be clear that we are actually in a declining production of our natural gas. We always have been a major gas producer for Northwest Europe, but since 2018, we have become a gas importer as we have been closing down our big growing gas field. And also the small fields in the Dutch North Sea are on decline. And currently we're still producing 15 BCM of natural gas, which is about 40% of the annual use. And in the current planning, we will stop our gas production completely around 2040. Which makes us think of what is the new energy source to provide energy for the country and for Northwest Europe. Here clearly we are in a transition phase and we are deploying vast amounts of offshore wind as many countries around the North Sea. And we are moving quickly to a major source of renewable power from offshore wind to be deployed in the shallow waters in the southern North Sea and also the rest of the North Sea. And for the Netherlands, it means a potential of up to 60 gigawatt of offshore wind, which can partly be replacing our gas production from our offshore fields. But it will also have its limits. It's limited by space in the North Sea, but it's also limited by the capacity to be absorbed in the grid. And on the left, you see the offshore wind parks, which are currently under development, and they're moving further offshore. And on the right, you see the connections of the cables of these wind parks to shore. And as you can see, these cables have to get connected further inland to fit into the grid. And that will come to limitations around 2030, when the capacity of the grid is not sufficient to absorb all the energy in the form of electrons. And if you look in the broader perspective of the shallow southern North Sea, this is the UK on the left and the Netherlands on the right. You see in the middle a combination of platforms, oil and gas platforms, pipelines, and also the colors are the wind parks which are under development in the UK, the Netherlands, and also in Germany in the northwest. And you see there's more and more offshore wind being produced, even further offshore, above 100 kilometers offshore, which requires transmission of this energy in the form of high voltage DC cables and oil and gas fields in decline, which gives new potential, for example, storage of energy or storage of CO2, and pipelines which may have a future capacity for transporting CO2 and hydrogen. And that actually covers quite a range in the southern North Sea area, which gives a potential to actually find new functions for this infrastructure and an integrated development of offshore wind and deployment of CO2 storage and hydrogen production from electrolysis. So in the future, the North Sea will be extremely important also in the sustainable energy supply in the offshore environment, because moving from oil and gas as the major source of energy towards green electricity from offshore wind and solar, we also need green molecules. And hydrogen is one of the envisaged green molecule for our energy supply and also for feedstock. And in the intermediate range, we will also use blue energy, which is still based on fossil sources like natural gas or oil, but has low carbon emission as we capture the CO2, for example. And blue hydrogen is an example of it. But in all these transition phases, the North Sea is extremely important for storage of CO2 and transport, for hydrogen production, transport, large-scale energy storage, and also electrification of our still existing platforms. So in the North Sea Energy Program, we're working together with oil and gas companies, with renewable energy, wind operators, and supply industry to match this complex puzzle of CO2 storage, hydrogen production and transport, natural gas production, and wind power production with cables to shore. And we've actually looked together with a number of partners to what are the best options for system integration of large-scale offshore wind and offshore gas infrastructure to balance the future energy system and to accelerate deployment of renewable energy. Of course, with the aim to reduce emissions, CO2, greenhouse gases, but also NOx, to provide grid balancing and energy storage options, to make efficient use of societal cost and capital, and also make use of the already invested capital in the form of offshore assets. And we have identified 4 attractive options for the North Sea, which could also be applied elsewhere around the world. Electrification of platforms from offshore wind, power to gas conversion, so hydrogen production and transport from offshore wind, carbon capture and storage in depleted gas fields, and energy storage in the form of hydrogen in depleted gas fields or salt caverns. And of course, in the offshore development, these developments will come in a sequence. For the next decade, we expect a lot of oil and gas platforms to be electrified from offshore wind, while thereafter, after the gas fields are depleted, carbon capture and storage will be developed in the Netherlands, in the UK, also in Norway and Denmark to a large extent. And on the longer term, in the next decades to come, with far offshore wind being deployed, hydrogen conversion, both onshore and also offshore, will be deployed on a large scale and has the potential to reuse some of the aspects of the assets of oil and gas industry. So in the future, the energy system in the North Sea will be a much more integrated system where we have electrons and molecules, grey molecules, green molecules, and electrons from offshore wind, but we may also produce, for example, from the green hydrogen and CO2, the new molecules for the future transport, shipping, for example, but also basic feedstock for chemical industry or even for future aviation fuels. So the complex system on the North Sea for energy production, energy storage and energy transport will still be there in the future, far after oil and gas will be depleted. Just a few more details on some of these technical options. Platform electrification could save quite some emissions on CO2 and NOx. It will save fuel gas, which is now burned. About 5% of the gas produced in the Dutch sector is burned for power generation. It also reduces operational costs and it can extend the lifetime of the platforms, and thereby also enabling future activities on this platform for CO2 storage and hydrogen production. So it's quite an attractive way to actually directly reduce emissions from oil and gas production. And we are looking into our program how much CO2 emissions and NOx emissions can be saved. What are the options for developing an electric integrated grid to connect all these offshore platforms to one another in the offshore system, and then connect it to the wind parks, which are in green on this picture. And we found out that you can save quite a lot of cost from this electric infrastructure if you optimize it as an integrated system instead of connecting each individual platform to the wind parks. CO2 transport and storage. There's a huge capacity of storage in depleted gas fields in the Netherlands, about 1,700 megatons of CO2. And a number of projects are under development in the Netherlands, but also in Norway and in the UK, to store vast amounts of CO2 in the depleted fields. And of course, for the injection, you also need power to actually pump the CO2 into the subsurface, and you don't want to produce that power from natural gas. So we're using clean energy from offshore wind for that. And on the right, you see the infrastructure which could be developed for CO2 storage in the Netherlands, starting in Rotterdam, Amsterdam, and Groningen, to connect the industry clusters where the CO2 is captured to the storage sites in the depleted gas fields. And here you can see the big volumes of CO2 stored in the current gas fields, which are becoming completed. And in that way, we can actually minimize the socialized cost for energy transition and reuse part of the infrastructure from oil and gas. It can also enable the production of blue hydrogen in the system, where the hydrogen is still produced from natural gas, but CO2 is stored in the gas fields. And in the future, it can even enable negative emissions from direct air capture or biomass created energy. And of course, part of the gas infrastructure could be reused for the transport of CO2. And then the last option, which is very attractive at the moment, is actually converting offshore wind power to hydrogen on existing platforms or on new platforms or even energy islands. And then all the energy can be transported to shore via pipelines, which can save a lot of costs on transport via power cables and high voltage DC conversion systems. It can also enable grid balancing and seasonal storage of the energy produced intermittently from offshore wind. And there's different options to be studied. The conversion could take place in the turbine itself, and then the compression could take place at a platform. The conversion could be on the platform itself, and it could also be on energy islands, artificial islands, for example, in the shallow North Sea. And this is an example. We did a calculation on what's the size and the scale of such an island if you go to a gigawatt scale, which is needed beyond 2030. And we found out that if you move to distances further offshore than 100 kilometers, an energy island concept could become economic. But it's all still depending on the additional costs that you have for electrolysis in an offshore environment. Now, this is not all studies or theory. In the Netherlands and also elsewhere in the North Sea area, we are developing projects and pilots to make this happen, both on electrification of platforms, on hydrogen production in an offshore environment, and also on CO2 storage. You see 3 examples of operators who are working on this, and I'd like to highlight one of them, which is the Poseidon pilot. It's offshore hydrogen production on an existing live oil and gas producing platform of Neptune Energy. And we are feeding green energy from a nearby wind park to the platform, thereby splitting seawater into hydrogen and oxygen. Of course, the seawater is desalinized first, and then the hydrogen is mixed with the natural gas and produced to shore with the natural gas. And this is a small scale pilot, 1 megawatt, but it's to demonstrate and learn about offshore hydrogen production for the future development towards gigawatt scale. So conclusions of our work, which you can also find actually on our website with all underlying reports, is that offshore wind will provide a large amount of clean energy for the energy system of Northwest Europe in the future. Hydrogen is a robust solution in this energy system, and it will be a balanced mix of blue and green hydrogen production. Offshore hydrogen production is becoming economic once you move to distances further offshore of about 100 kilometers and on a large scale, gigawatt scale, where it could be implemented on platforms but also on energy islands. And carbon capture and storage is still needed to minimize the socialized cost of energy transition, which will also enable the introduction of blue hydrogen and also allow on the long-term negative emissions. And last but not least, a coordinated and cross-sectoral approach for the power grid development, for example, offshore, will enable cost saving and also emission saving and support future innovations for deep decarbonizations. And that's where I'd like to leave it for this moment. If you'd like to have more information, please check our website or get in contact, and we're happy to answer all your questions. Thank you very much.
And thank you to Renee for that, and I look forward to covering all of that during the panel session later on. There's the North Sea Energy is a project we as a Net Zero Technology Center are also part of. There's a lot of collaboration going on with TNO in particular. We recently published a website which is a research on the cross-North Sea integration between different sources of energy, which is onenorthsea.com if you want to have a look later on, not now. And so there's a lot there which is very similar, which is, I think, conducive to this collaboration that we're talking today. But now let's take a bit of a journey and go to the other side of the world. And the next speaker is Andrew Ross from the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, also known as CSIRO.
Now, before I get started on the topic, I just wanted to give you a quick introduction to CSIRO, where I come from. So I'm Andrew Ross from CSIRO, and I work for the Commonwealth Science and Industrial Research Organisation. We're effectively Australia's national science agency, located at 57 sites, both in Australia and globally. And we're one of the world's largest multidisciplinary science technology organisations, addressing national research challenges across as diverse topics as agriculture and food, all the way through to health and biosecurity and everything in between. I work in the energy business unit, and we're really focused on the energy transition and how it's going to occur and emissions reduction. So let's get into the topic area today that I'm going to cover. So if we start from Northern Australia, this bit here is located close to Southeast Asia, and a large number of countries. The Northern Territory particularly is an export-driven economy, and many of those exports are minerals and energy, and they get exported up into our regional neighbours, be it Singapore, South Korea, Japan, China, etc. Those partners have made commitments to net zero or by 2050 or 2060 in the case of China, and also have nearer term commitments, and we've heard over the last year about Japanese commitment to reductions of 46% in emissions by 2030, and the proposed 40% reductions by South Korea by 2030 as well. As just two examples. As I said, Northern Territory export industry is dominated by gas industry exports, and that's exported to a number of our Southeast Asian markets. The liquid natural gas that comes out of the Northern Territory represents up to 16.2% of Japanese LNG imports, so very important energy supply for some of our key export nations. So Northern Territory also has many offshore gas fields that are heavily invested into by international companies. And I think all of those companies have very strong commitments to reducing their emissions by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. So whilst Northern Territory has a relatively low emissions intensity or emissions, total emissions when compared with both other jurisdictions within Australia and also regionally, many of those emissions are associated with energy and extractive industries. And we'll come back to that in a minute or two. So when we look at Northern Australia gas resources, we've got very large gas resources, both onshore and offshore. Some of those fields have a high CO2 content, and they are also in existing production, and they're brought into the Darwin region, specifically into the two LNG export plants located in Darwin. Those plants already capture CO2 from those gas streams, but at the moment they're vented to atmosphere. The gas industry represents a significant economic value in the Northern Territory and also for Australia, associated with the export industry. So that's the existing gas industry in the Northern Territory. There's now an emerging renewable energy industry coming in as well. So there's very large renewable resource across Northern Australia and including in the Northern Territory region, a very large photovoltaic power potential. And there are a number of proposed mega renewable projects under development, one of which is Sun Cable, which is going to be based in the Northern Territory in this sort of area, which is $22 billion investment, 10 gigawatt solar farm scheduled for 2026 to come online. So what we've got is a very large existing gas industry and a potential large renewable industry coming forward. So hopefully that's a bit of scene setting. So why do we want to investigate Northern Territory and Northern Australia low emission hub? Well, we want to permit the decarbonisation of carbon intensive industries in the Northern Territory while promoting the development of new low emission industries to grow the economy through the transition. We want to maintain those grow those existing industries whilst lowering their emissions intensity, and understand if there's a potential development of a low emissions integrated petrochemical industry using the existing gas resource or other hydrocarbon resources, or even develop that through a renewable route. Can we enable the rapid development of a hydrogen export industry and domestic utilisation hub through a low emission hub development? And can we actually achieve what is a Australian government stretch target of hydrogen under $2 per kilo? Another challenge for a low emission hub, or opportunity for a low emission hub, is can we enable the development of a CO2 utilisation industry and develop a regional carbon abatement solution which can attract investment into the Northern Territory? And what we're looking at here is can we do CO2 compression storage for under $20 a tonne, which is another Australian government stretch target, technology stretch target. So the vision that we've put forward is that we can potentially build a low emission hub, which includes many of the components shown on the right here, that utilise those abundant gas reserves that are in the Territory. And what I haven't said already is that there are estimated very large storage potential in the near offshore of the Northern Territory, up to potentially 15 gigatons worth of CO2 storage, going by some of the estimates. As we've said already, there's abundant renewable resource. So can that be brought in to help stimulate a renewable hydrogen industry and also electrify many of the existing industries within the region and reduce emissions that way as well? There is potential to reuse existing infrastructure as fields come on to the end of the life, and that has the potential to reduce upfront capital cost for the development of a hub. And Santos have recently come out and talked about the reuse of Bayu-Undan pipeline and well infrastructure as part of a CCS project in the region. If we can build a low emission hub similar to the vision that we've got here, can we actually achieve the economy of scale that will lower the costs of storage, lower the costs of hydrogen export? And if you can bring all of these different elements together, there's going to be cross-sector coupling opportunities. So as I said already, renewable electrification, reuse of heat and cold, and hydrogen industry development and transition. So where would you actually put a hub of this kind of scale? Well, one of the possible locations is the Sustainable Development Precinct, which is in the middle arm of the Darwin Harbour, up here at the top of Australia. And that's been allocated by the Northern Territory government for this large-scale precinct. It's located next to existing energy projects, and what you can see in the picture down here on the left is the Ichthys LNG plant, which is just at the tip of the Middle Arm Sustainable Precinct. And the way we're sort of addressing the problem, or addressing the challenge here, is really thinking about it from a major engineering approach, going through the concept select, pre-feed, feed, FID, execution, and operation. And really what we're trying to do is bring together industry, government, and the innovation system to address the low emission hub challenge. And how do you build a low emission hub in Australia? Once we have all of those parties, then we can build a robust business case and understand the major development investment pathway going forward. To do this, though, collaboration is going to be key, and we're working very hard with the Australian government, the Northern Territory government, and a number of gas industry participants and engineering companies to really start to crystallise the vision of what a low emission hub looks like. And on a almost daily basis at the moment, we get further participants wanting to join the overall project. So hopefully I've given you a bit of a germ idea of the kind of things that we're doing in Australia at the moment, and very happy to answer questions in the Q&A session later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, and we also look forward to covering that in the panel discussion. One key theme that started to emerge is this concept of a low carbon hub, or energy island from the Netherlands, and we also in the Net Zero Technology Center have the energy hub concept, which you can explore if you're online on the Hop-in platform, or if you're here later on the screens that are in the lobby. But let's move on and stay in Australia. We're now moving west Australia, and our next speaker is Lee Kennedy from Nura, the National Energy Resources Australia.
My name is Lee Kennedy, here from Australia, and looking to talk to you today about Australia's hydrogen tech clusters. This is really one way that we're looking to solve some of the problem or some of the challenges we have in Australia. And I'll step you through over the next 10 minutes sort of what we're doing, some of the tangible actions we're taking forward. So a little bit about Nura. We're an independent, non-for-profit organisation that's really around connecting up technology SMEs with project operators around Australia. We've had a focus in the oil and gas space, but as the oil and gas industry is decarbonising and transitioning, so have we with the organisation, and looking to help make those connections throughout Australia and really trying to improve translation of Australian research IP and really building high-performing supply chains. So what is the challenge? It is the whole decarbonisation and energy transition, and we see in Australia that one of the key platforms to assist is the development of a hydrogen industry and the use of hydrogen in the areas where electrification isn't required. We are very lucky in Australia to have lots of different solutions to the current challenges, but today I'll just focus on hydrogen and what our role is doing. We've got CSIRO also on the panel, and they'll talk through some of the technologies that they've got on the go to solve this challenge too. So I guess Australia, we're also helping other countries solve their energy transition issues, most notably Japan and Korea. Australia's been keeping their lights on in Tokyo and Seoul for decades through the use of coal and LNG, so hydrogen will be the next technology. And just want to highlight that Australia is well positioned in the Asia Pacific region based on these significant trade relationships, existing know-how, and really leveraging that to diversify into the hydrogen space. So our challenge in Australia is to get production of hydrogen under $2, and that's $2 Australian. Once we get that, the actual opportunities for hydrogen really take off. That's when it starts becoming competitive with other existing incumbent technologies. And the way to do that, the real challenge for us, is to drive the cost down and make it cheaper. And we're trying to do that through scale and really scaling up the supply chain. And we're looking to do that through clustering. And clustering is a well-known concept, especially through Europe. And in Australia, we're looking to build 15 regional hydrogen clusters and coming from the ground up. Those 15 are then coming into a national network and working together to collaborate on opportunities, technologies, applications that can really drive the cost of hydrogen down, but also the applicability of decarbonising many different sectors throughout Australia. And that group wants to engage internationally, just like we're doing today on this call. How do we engage and partner with people like organisations in Germany, Norway, France? So we have complementary relationships, technologies and opportunities. So really, I just want to highlight what we are doing, what we're tangibly getting done in Australia. So as you'll see this map from the Australian map, this is the coverage of where our regional clusters are throughout Australia, one in every capital state and territory, which is fantastic to see, great coverage. Most people probably will understand the background of Newcastle and the Gippsland area, traditionally coal-based regions, either exporting coal to Asian importers or using brown coal in terms of our domestic electricity generation. So the challenge is to diversify those regions and create sustainable long-term jobs. And we really see the hydrogen clusters as a really great way to transition a lot of those regions and companies in those regions that have predominantly been in the mining or oil and gas space as would have been in Queensland. So we're focusing on the key themes on the right and really looking at some of those enabling activities, because if we get those enabling activities right, it will facilitate the technology solutions that will come through in the transportation, ag and food, and manufacturing. One thing we're also looking to do in Australia is actually bundle up our fantastic technology companies in the hydrogen space and develop a supercluster. And that's where we can really help collaborate and drive new opportunities, helping them export into our traditional export markets, but also into new emerging hydrogen markets in Europe, North America, to really grow their presence, but also help collaborate and create new solutions amongst one another. There's not a great deal of duplication in terms of the technology companies in Australia at the moment, so we're seeing great opportunities to collaborate. One slide and a resource that I always present on is Hive Resources, because it's a one-stop shop for Australian project information, as well as policy programs. So please, if you are looking for more information on the Australian industry, this is really the one-stop shop to go. We've currently got about 90 hydrogen projects there that are really open for investment, understanding how they can play a role in decarbonising not only Australian industry, but also international through export. There's also some phenomenal information on R&D opportunities as well, and scoping out what is happening in Australia. So I'd just like to close out that today is really a fantastic opportunity to present to this global network, this diverse audience, just quickly on what's happening in Australia and what Nura's looking to develop as part of the hydrogen cluster network. You'll hear from Cyro, and I'm sure there's others on the panel that we're talking about different technologies and different programs they're looking to deliver to meet the challenges of today and tomorrow. So please, if you do want to engage internationally with the cluster network and with Nura, please reach out, and I look forward to joining the panel later today. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you, Lee, and we look forward to that as well. And isn't that exciting? You know, because I think all these presentations are some themes are emerging. You know, the cluster, the integration, the cross-sector, hydrogen, CCS, and so that is, I think, really vindicating the decision to have this summit and to bring all these organizations, this country together, and to share that knowledge and to see what part of that journey can be done together. One of the things that came out many times today is CCS, and I'm very glad that, you know, the next speaker is in the room, and it's Professor Stuart Hazeldine from SCCS, the Scottish Carbon Capture and Storage Research Centre in Edinburgh, and he's going to tell us about CCS. He's an internationally recognized authority in that matter, so we look forward to hearing from you, Stuart.
How do you turn that one on?
It is on.
Is it on? Okay. Yep. Right, thank you very much. So I'm Stuart Hazeldine from Scottish Carbon Capture and Storage and the University of Edinburgh, which is about 50 kilometres east of here in Scotland. And in Scotland, we're on a decarbonisation journey, of course, to try and rescue the climate from the CO2 excess we've got. And in Scotland, we've got the opportunities to do that through large industrial complexes, through the large, on the left of the slide there, through the oil and gas industry, because clearly we're the home of the offshore oil and gas industry, which is a world-class resource. But we also have a lot of nature-based solutions as well. So we can have a mix of industrial plus nature. Next slide, please. So the SCCS we set up about 2006. We set that up very early before the energy transition was fashionable and had arrived. And we did that deliberately by creating links between academia and university research, because Scotland has about 6 universities actively engaged in this energy transition now, to make those links between academic work, between government policy and government ambition, and also to engage with industry, to try and advise industry, but also to work with industry and solve industrial problems. So over those years since 2006, we've kept about 6 to 8 staff employed as that linkage. We've deliberately made linkages between university, industry and government, and we've had contacts with about 700 different businesses globally, 300 academics in Scotland and in the UK, and we also have been participating in training the next generation of researchers through PhDs and MScs. Next slide, please. So 2 or 3 of the things we've done about CO2 storage and CCS, and then I'll look a little bit into the future. So one of the first things we did was in around 2005, 2006, recognized that the North Sea had great potential for CO2 storage, but nobody had ever done a proper assessment of that. So we led the first regional assessment around the UK of CO2 storage, which speakers have mentioned, as we now think has got about 70 to 80 billion tonnes of storage, so enough for 200 years worth of industrial activity feeding into that. And that preliminary work we did in university, we then participated in industrialising that through the Energy Technologies Institute in the UK, which put that onto a web-based database in 2012. And now, from about 2016 onwards, that database is curated by the British Geologic Survey and the Crown Estate. And you can see that map of the CO2 storage sites, and that's now the basis of those 4 major cluster and industrial CO2 capture and storage projects which were mentioned earlier on. The factual basis and the knowledge that we have an immense opportunity of large CO2 storage only tens of kilometres away from very large industrial and business sources of carbon dioxide. Next slide, please. Or press again. And from that, we did some more research based on the data, that database. We exploited that database of CO2 storage and the knowledge of CO2 test sites around the world, and also of natural CO2 occurrences, to try and understand the risks and the retention capability of CO2 storage, because that's one of the key questions both industry and citizens always ask, is when is it going to leak, to which I say it's not ever going to leak. So this diagram on the right is from our article in 2018, where we tried to put all that together into a conceptual model about the various processes geologically going on, the various processes of engineering mitigation which you can do to assist that storage, and reduce and eliminate leakage of carbon dioxide in the dark blue along through the cap rock, through boreholes or along geological faults. And the basic answer we've come out with there is a pretty useful answer to answer those questions, that over a period of 10,000 years into the future, then we should say that 98% of that CO2 will remain underground. And that's by far the best retention of carbon out of any of the solutions we have, any of the industrial or nature-based solutions. Nothing else can match that for scale, for quality, for monitorability, and actually for low price per tonne over that 10,000-year period. Next slide, please. One of the things we also have done is to support projects in the UK. This is the Acorn Project based out of Scotland. You can see the map on the right, based out of St Fergus, north of Aberdeen, the oil capital of Scotland and of Europe. And this reuses existing infrastructure, tries to reuse a white pipeline onshore, an existing pipeline which formerly used to bring hydrocarbon products from the North Sea down into the industrial central belt of Scotland here. We plan to convert that and turn that into a CO2 takeaway pipeline from the industrial petroleum refinery and petrochemical plants and petroleum industries around Grangemouth to take that CO2 up to St Fergus and then send that offshore through legacy pipelines which still exist from the oil and gas industry to reduce the cost and increase the speed of delivery and decrease the risk of that project. And one of the key questions was the storage site, and you can see on the right-hand side there, underneath the Acorn logo, we have a dark blue ribbon of sand, which is the Captain sandstone, a lower Cretaceous age sandstone, and that's magnified on the panel on the left. And the key question was, could we inject multiple sites along that sandstone? And that sandstone is a very long, thin sandstone. We have to be aware of that size scale. That's probably three times the distance from Edinburgh to Glasgow. It's 100 kilometres, 150 kilometres. So these are large-scale sites. But the key thing with CO2 storage is the pressure pulse. As you're injecting more and more fluid CO2, you're increasing the volume, and that increases the pressure. Does those pressures interfere with each other and then combine to break the seal? So we did a multi-university study on that together with 2 or 3 partner oil companies to provide data and advice. And we basically did very good simulation of the underburden, the overburden and the side burden. For the first time, again, we looked at the three-dimensionality of that and basically concluded 35 million tonnes a year of CO2 injection is perfectly feasible. So we gave a very clear answer, and that formed part of the bidding for that Acorn project, commercial bidding in to the UK government. Next slide, please. And we also looked at exploration for storage sites. So here's that same sandstone in blue there, and part of the UK request is that each industrial cluster has at least 2 storage sites in case one fails. So we've got one storage site there with the Captain sandstone I just talked about, but where are we going to put the other one? There's a whole swathe of oil field names there, a whole swathe of data, legacy data from oil and gas boreholes. So what we did was process all that to try and identify the best overall site. Next slide, please. And we innovated there the idea of using multi-criteria analysis. So on that cross-plot graph, we've got 2 out of maybe 15 different criteria. We plot them against each other, and we look at a particular borehole and see how close to or how far away from the ideal criteria that borehole is. So we can give that a number, a ranking, and we can assemble all those numbers to a numerical answer. And next slide, that gives us the answer that the best site lies within that green ellipse, and that again was the site, the particular site was just the backup storage which was put forward to UK government. So again, we've had a very direct input by coordinating university and industrial research to achieve a tangible result. As Luca said, this is now underway, all this. This is not pie in the sky for the future. This is actually now slight history happening now and continuing to happen into the future. Next slide, please. One of the other things we're also doing now is looking into the future. So people have talked about hydrogen. There's also a big mission for hydrogen in the UK, particularly in Scotland. And if we generate hydrogen, that usage of hydrogen seldom will match the generation of hydrogen, because we have a big summer to winter swing in the chemical energy we use in the UK. So one of the things we need to do is develop storage. So building bullet tanks out of stainless steel on the surface is really, really expensive. You can store hydrogen in salt caverns beneath the ground, but the distribution of geological salt is not uniform around the UK. So there are many areas where we've got sandstones. We have sandstones offshore, we have depleted gas fields. Can we put hydrogen into sandstones? So in the University of Edinburgh, we're doing fundamental basic research for the first time with special laboratory equipment in the central panel to look at sandstone pore space, put hydrogen into that pore space, look at the distribution of hydrogen, how that travels through, how that might leak, how that might be retained. So three-dimensional CT scanning of the pore space and high pressure, underground pressure and temperature simulation for hydrogen moving through cores of rock. And that will feed into a real project here on the left-hand side. This is collaborating with Scottish Gas Networks, our regional gas distribution company for all of Scotland. There is an existing 7 gigawatt windmill on the coast in East Scotland that is now feeding into electrolysis to produce green hydrogen. That green hydrogen is now being set up to supply 300 houses in East Scotland, which will be the first time in the world that domestic houses have been supplied with hydrogen for heating and cooking. And that is aiming to be supplying that hydrogen by 2023. Next slide. And after that, we'll be moving on to try and feed hydrogen into the gas grid network. So from St Fergus near Aberdeen to generate hydrogen, feed 2% hydrogen into the gas grid and then go up to 20% hydrogen. And then eventually, when the regulation catches up and the legislation catches up, try and move towards 100% hydrogen using a legacy existing pipe distribution network to minimize the technical and the financial cost of transition. Next slide, please. Now, again, looking to the future, I mentioned we've got many nature-based solutions in Scotland. These are very popular amongst government and very popular amongst citizens who want to plant lots and lots of trees. And we have to be cautious, though, about what we're getting for our tree planting. So trees can capture carbon. Trees are very poor at storing carbon. Trees are great at restoring wildlife and habitat. Trees are not very good at putting carbon back into the ground. So here's a map to try and demonstrate that map. This blue and red map is actually from the Office of National Statistics in the UK, a slightly surprising source. But they've plotted the CO2 emission per as coloured in per administrative unit, our district councils and governments in the UK. And you can see the dark blue areas in southern Scotland and surprisingly perhaps in the very south of England are capturing lots and lots of carbon. Those are very forested areas with planted trees. So they're good at capturing carbon. The red areas are degraded peatlands or city areas. They're vast carbon emitters. And there's a lot of conversation that the blue areas, the forestry areas, are capturing carbon. The Scottish Government claims 15 million tonnes a year of negative emissions from those trees, capturing carbon from the air into the trees and storing that carbon temporarily in the trees. But of course the trees only last for 40 years, whereas we've got to store the carbon for 10,000 years. So it's still a very open question about how we're going to do something with all that forestry wood to actually store the carbon. And the other factor with this is we've also then got to be honest about the rest of the land use, and you can see that there's pale blue areas on there which are in the east of Scotland, and those pale blue areas are emitting carbon because they're areas of agriculture and arable land, and so fertiliser made from methane, of course, and ploughing of the land releases carbon and releases carbon. So overall, in the whole landmass, we're not storing 15 million tonnes a year, we're only storing about 5 or 6 million tonnes a year through those natural processes. So we have to be careful with the arithmetic. So there's a contribution to be made, but we have to be honest about that. But an unrealised contribution, next slide, is I think what people have ignored so far. Press the button again, please. And that's the contribution of biocarbon from fermentation and combustion processes. So here we've compiled, this is work in progress now at Scottish Carbon Capture and Storage, we've compiled all the biological emissions which remain uncaptured sources of pure CO2, which are going to waste into the atmosphere. So at the top of the panel there, we have a combined heat and power scheme burning biomass. So biomass is great, but if you burn it and release the CO2 into the atmosphere, you're not actually really doing anybody any favours at all. So there's 400,000 tonnes a year of CO2 going to waste. Another biomass plant at Stevens Croft in southern Scotland, fed directly by trees, is releasing 300,000 a year going to waste. And then there's a whole swathe of fermentation, brewing and distilling industries, which are CO2, a large major industry in Scotland, pure CO2 going to waste. Next slide, please. And lastly, I think the last thing I want to talk about is creating a market for CO2 storage. Everybody asks, why are we not doing carbon capture and storage? Because there's no market for it. That's why we're not doing it. So our proposition here is the UK can, or any jurisdiction can create a law, and the law says that the producers of carbon have to be liable for the storage of that carbon, in just the same way that producers of washing machines have to take back the washing machine and disassemble it and store that and recycle the washing machine. So a law to recycle carbon, the extractors take on board that law and that liability. They charge a slightly larger wholesale price, arrow number 2, to industry and consumers. That slightly larger wholesale price is what's tunneled through to pay for the carbon storage, and once that carbon storage is done, that is verified, bottom left, and that verification cancels the liability. Next slide, please. So the theory of this is 1 tonne of carbon extracted equals 1 tonne of carbon stored. We have a balance. Next slide, please. We, the consumers, pay slightly more, but actually we'll only be paying 1 or 2% more in the overall bill, because this is the cheapest, most effective way of storing carbon. Next slide, please. To summarise then, we've enabled university R&D in Scotland to connect with industry, to connect with government by active partnership in the past, in the present, and moving into the future, and that moves across the whole of the development chain, but that did need patient support by government for about 10 years to get that up and running and to build the contacts and the credibility. But now we've got that running, and that's good, and thanks to Net Zero Tech Centre for inviting us to speak.
Thank you very much, Stuart. That was fascinating and well-deserved applause, and it goes into the world of storage, CO2, of hydrogen, but also natural storage, the economic model, legislation, everything is in there. And that's a demonstration how complex somehow the solution is. There's not a simple one. And next speaker, and I'm very pleased to welcome them, is a trio of speakers this time, and they came all the way from Brazil. Of course, they came from the COP26, not specific for our event, but we're very pleased that they made the effort and are here today. And they're one of the 11 centers that, working together on that challenge. So from South America, from Brazil, and from the Sao Paulo Research Center for Greenhouse Gas Innovation, please welcome Giulio Meneghini, Gustavo Assi, and Karen Mascarenhas.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Gustavo Assi, my colleague Giulio Meneghini and Karen Mascarenhas from the Research Center for Greenhouse Gas Innovation. We're based at the University of São Paulo in Brazil. Glad to be here. Thank you for welcoming us to the summit. We're going to talk about how Brazil has a good potential for the climate change and energy transition regarding its whole matrix of agriculture, energy matrix, and also, of course, oil and gas as part of that. And today, how can you press the button, or you go for us? Okay, next one. Okay, here at the back. Good, I'll do it for us, yeah. Good. So just to discuss a little bit of the Brazil routes to net zero and how the integration of several industrial sectors is a key strategy for our country specifically. Karen.
Well, Brazil is committed to achieving the carbon neutrality by 2060 with distinct reduction targets in greenhouse gas emissions in 2025, so there is about 37% reduction, and also in 2030 with 43% reduction. However, carbon neutrality should not be considered as on its own, but must be taken into account other aspects of sustainability development, especially for developing countries. And that's what we're going to talk about a bit today.
Well, good morning again. Thank you very much, Luca, for inviting us to present that. And then one of the main issues in Brazil is, well, how to store and how to have a life cycle, a long life cycle for carbon on land. And then I'm going to talk on land, what we are going to work with, nature-based solutions, and then I can give you an example. We have a couple of projects to do and to develop a hydrogel that can store in the soil CO2 through oxalic acid, and then to increase the productivity of agriculture and pasture, and also reforesting. We have some projects also regarding bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. That's very interesting because few people know that Brazil, for instance, and the United States, as Professor Stewart has said very well, they produce ethanol and about 100 billion liters per year. And then you have almost 100 billion kilos of CO2, pure CO2 that's released to the atmosphere. It's about 0.2% of the total of the world emissions of CO2. And then you can capture that CO2 and produce SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuel, using, for instance, not only CO2, but of course hydrogen coming from hydrolysis of vinasse, that's the liquid waste of ethanol. And then we can produce what we are calling the third generation ethanol. It's not the second generation, is the second generation or the first generation with BECS, with bioenergy carbon capture and storage, to make even more, how can I say, friendly ethanol being produced in Brazil and in the US. And also, we have some other projects that are dealing with the production of green hydrogen, and that's going to be on land. And apart from that, we have a couple of projects to mitigate methane emissions using a new technique that has been developed in the past 5 years to develop labyrinth seals to reduce, for some estimations that we did together with Shell, that technique, the labyrinth seal using topology optimization, can reduce up to 60% the emissions, the fugitive emissions of methane in large compressors of methane. And these are some of the projects that we are going to work. And now Gustavo is going to say some words in the ocean.
Yeah, moving from inland offshore now. I'm an ocean and naval architect. So Brazil has a very large and mature industry for oil and gas. And of course, our oil and gas is from ultra deep waters, as you might know. And our goal in the country is then to revert and use this technology now matured from the oil and gas exploration into carbon capture and storage and utilization offshore. Of course, there are many possibilities, some of them still under fundamental research and technology to press that CO2 under the ground. But especially in Brazil, we are blessed to have many salt domes around the country, and especially offshore near the oil and gas production fields. And in our center, we have then developed one very interesting study to build by leaching the salt domes, by leaching and building the salt caves offshore, and then pump CO2 in supercritical state into the salt caverns offshore, close to the oil and gas fields. And this could give us a storage of up to 8 to 10 million tons of CO2 in one single salt cavern, very near the production fields. So our equation in Brazil then is, of course, it's a big country, continental scale, but because of the large scale of the industrial sectors of cement, fertilizers, agriculture, steel, and many other industrial sectors inland, also with the technology and the oil and gas offer from the offshore exploration, we believe the combination of the two sides is what will provide Brazil neutrality and even negative emissions if you combine with the ethanol cycle of energy generation. Karen?
Well, in this scenario, the RCGI is a center that appears really as a developing technology for greenhouse gas reduction with a focus in energy transition. That's why the focus is to support Brazil to achieve the NDCs and also working together with academy, industry, and government. That's the way we are organized, and this makes us with a good deal of being able to contribute in these aspects.
And then, of course, there are many, many routes, and there's a huge need for development, especially in our countries with the specific vocation of Brazil. So in our center, we try to tackle combined efforts on electrification, CCUS, and bioenergy and hydrogen as well. And of course, this should bring us, I hope, one step closer to neutrality in the future. There are some pictures of recent research projects, but I'm sure if you are interested, we can chat a bit more later on. Now, Julio?
And, well, as Gustavo said and Karen said, we have, I think, a huge potential to become negative, some parts of Brazil to become very negative and intensive in terms of CO2 capturing and storage and the use of CO2. I mentioned a few of them. The ethanol and biofuel in Brazil is something that's very well developed since the late 70s. I think that has been developed. It's one of the few countries in the world that you have most of the liquid fuel for light vehicles, completely renewable fuel, and most of the cars in Brazil are now flex cars, flex in terms of fuel consumption. You can use petrol or ethanol, pure ethanol, E100, and using these new technologies, using BECCS and using other technologies, I think we are becoming negative and can be applied to other sites in the world. Well, but of course it depends on support of public policies for sustainable development and public perception that Karen is going to say some words.
Well, the success of energy transition does not only depend on energy engineering practices and technologies, but also involves social, political, and economical factors, as well as public acceptance. This discussion about the transition paths and technologies in Brazil is recent, and few studies address Brazilian social perception and engagement. However, understanding the drivers of such perceptions and the specificities of the diverse stakeholders as industry, academy, media, government, non-government institutions, and society are key for the success of an open and productive dialogue. Brazilian population is sensitive to climate change and recognize global warming is a serious issue, although their awareness of the technologies aiming to fight such threats are not well known. Demographics, ideology, political partisan, level of trust on government and industry, as well as psychological factors as identity, beliefs, group identification, and others shape people's behaviors and attitudes. To achieve the ambitious NDC's targets and leave a better world for the future generations will require to leave no one behind. Everyone has to be involved as it is required behavioral changes as a huge challenge. The Center is also engaged in providing knowledge and tools to understand and stimulate an open and productive dialogue with stakeholders, including society. Please visit our website for further information and keep in touch. It is over there.
Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed our elementary school type of presentation with 3 people. It's been fun, and we're happy to be here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And congratulations for the choreography and being in sync between the three speakers. That has been fascinating. And of course, fascinating is the importance and the size of Brazil and the natural resources are a key element in the global challenge to climate change. And you mentioned a few elements there, legislation, public perception, awareness of the technology, which is partially why we're here on the awareness and promoting that collaboration. It's now time for our panel. So I'll invite Stuart and is Giulio taking the stage for Brazil. Thank you. And if we can have our other presenters on the screen from Australia and from the Netherlands, that'd be great. So here we are, end of day 2. Please take a seat. Stuart, join us on stage. There are plenty of questions coming up to choose from. Let me go through one of that. I think this last one is particularly topical. Collaboration is essential, national and internationally. What actions are oil and gas stakeholders taking to work outside and beyond their own network? And what is the perception, maybe, if you can start from Australia, just because you're ahead in the day, and maybe you have a bit more time and more coffees and ready to start with that question. Well, how do you see that international collaboration and the cross-sector collaboration from the oil and gas industry?
I can go here. I think there's a very strong appetite to collaborate across industry and government, and both nationally and internationally. Within the partners that are working on the Northern Territory work that I talked about earlier on, we've got European companies, we've got Japanese companies, and other interested parties from around the globe all wanting to work on the problem of how we generate that low emission hub in the Northern Territory. So very, very strong appetite to collaborate. Very different from how the industry perhaps worked in the past, but everybody sees this as a shared challenge.
Thanks, Andrew. And just to give some really clear examples, Woodside, ASX listed oil and gas company that's transitioning to hydrogen or clean hydrogen. They've just invested in a US thermal solar project, or company Halogen Energy. So it's a great example of where oil and gas companies are transitioning, and we can just see it in Australia now. Even the traditional pipeline companies, APCO, AGIG, they're all looking at different partnership models and taking a step further for us in Australia to really capture the opportunity and take advantage. It's not only partnership, but it's totally looking at the business models and how you can bring different partners to the table to help de-risk some of the elements of what are complex projects that we've heard about what's going on in Scotland. And there's similar in Australia, and it's really everyone coming to the table with a fresh perspective, learning from one another and being open to understanding how to get projects over the line.
Thank you, Ian. Andrew. And Giulio, perspective from Brazil?
Well, in some sense, I believe that Brazil is very similar to Australia and to the US. And then now we are in a period of time in Brazil that we became one of the biggest oil producers in the world. And at the same time, we have to fulfill our NDCs. And then the need for the oil companies in Brazil and also for the Brazilian government to try to support research for NBS, and because even the oil industry is interested in NBS in order to compensate for their production of oil. And then I just mentioned the hydrogel. The hydrogel we are developing in our center, but it was an idea that started in Shell, the hydrogel to be employed in the agriculture and reforestation and so on. And also the other clear path towards BECS and CCU and advocacy. The oil industry in Brazil is very active in terms of supporting such initiatives in order to try to compensate their oil and gas production that's increasing, and it's really increasing nowadays in Brazil.
Interesting. Stuart or Renee, maybe after you want to add something on this topic?
So I see a lot of interest from hydrocarbon companies in the transition, but I'm also aware that as an overall part of the total budget of oil and gas companies, this transition is still not a major part. So it's happening, but it's not happening, I don't think, fast enough for the way that citizens want to move and the way that the climate mission requires it to move. And the other thing I observe is, two things I observe is, on the optimistic side, in the clusters we've talked about in the UK, in the industrial clusters, and the ambition to decarbonise industry and to decarbonise lots of electricity and our energy use by 2040, 2045, a lot of that is now being led by multinational oil and gas companies. So all of those cluster bids in the UK have very, very significant participation from oil companies, and even leadership by oil and gas companies a lot of the time, because those companies are one of the very few human organizations that we've got who can routinely deliver a multi-billion-dollar project with 25 global partners on time into a budget. And so we have to use the expertise from those oil and gas companies. And my final caveat, though, is I think there's a schism, there's a segmentation between the European companies who all see now that transition is essential, and the United States companies, and of course the state oil companies worldwide, who are perhaps not quite so convinced that they need to move rapidly into this transition. So the world still has a problem, even though Europe and some parts of maybe Brazil and Australia have less of a problem. We still need to have big conversations with those companies globally.
We had the Americans yesterday. Unfortunately, they're not connected today, so I can't go to them for a reply. But staying in Europe, Renee, what do you see on that perspective?
Yeah, I can give you a little bit of perspective from the North Sea region. We see the North Sea operators really working intensively on a topic like CCS, carbon capture and storage. We mentioned it already a few times. You see companies collaborating there, like in the Northern Lights project with Total, Equinor and Shell working together to get it going. Also in areas like methane emissions and emission reductions, there's the methane partnership that many operators are working together globally, actually. But you see the new areas that we're discussing, the hydrogen development, offshore wind development, marine energy in general, that operators are really investing and taking positions there. As an example from the Netherlands, Shell is working actively to develop a strong position in offshore wind and also in the hydrogen. On the topic of offshore hydrogen production, we see a lot of initiatives and huge projects announced by Shell, for example, the North H2 project to produce 10 gigawatt of offshore wind and then 1 megaton of hydrogen of that. So I think the operators are more collaborating. They're seeking also collaboration with energy companies like RWE and NACO, big players in Europe. But as long as they do not invest a significant part of their total investment budget in renewables, I think the transition is going too slow. And you also see still operators bringing back their profits to shareholders, which is, I think, a pity if there's potential for investing in renewable energy. So I think we could speed up with this transition for the major oil and gas players around the world.
Thank you. Another call for pace and acceleration then, just like Stuart said. Can I stay with you, Renee? We have a question here about, there's a lot of talk about using existing subsea pipe work and in general also about reusing oil and gas infrastructure. But how long will these pipelines be sound for, or when will they need to be replaced? And maybe I'll come to Stuart after for the same topic, for the onshore and offshore pipeline as well. But Renee.
Yeah, that is of course a very good question, and it's being tackled and studied in the Netherlands as well, because we are repurposing also the onshore gas grid for hydrogen transport. We will build a hydrogen backbone in the Netherlands, which is based on the gas grid, which has been there for 50 years already about. But still the technical maturity and integrity of the infrastructure is still healthy. Of course, it's being inspected regularly and being controlled, and the same holds partly for offshore infrastructure. And not all infrastructure is ready for reuse for hydrogen or CO2. It depends very much on the materials used, which are different for different pipelines and both onshore and offshore. We do have a first experience in the Netherlands because part of the onshore grid of Gasunie, the Dutch TSO, has been repurposed for hydrogen transport. It's between a chemical plant of Dow and Yara, which is a fertilizer plant, and they're transporting hydrogen now through a formerly gas transport pipeline of 13 kilometers. And it's being, of course, extensively monitored and analyzed whether the hydrogen has any effect on the integrity. But it looks like this material is still ready to be used for the next decades for hydrogen service.
Thank you. Stuart, you were talking about the feeder 10, but you also look at the pipeline offshore, of course, for the Acorn Project. How long will they last?
Okay, so again, I support what Renee's just said, that really it's down to the evaluation of individual pipelines with the individual materials which have been used, how that pipeline's been looked after and maintained, and precisely what's moved through that in terms of corrosion or for hydrogen, the percolation of hydrogen into the metal. And so clearly we have the ability to start with many of these pipelines. We don't necessarily have the ability to finish, but finishing is in maybe 50 or 100 years or 200 years time, so I'm not so worried about that. But getting started is the important thing, because outside of rooms like this, I think there's still a lot of uncertainty and a lot of doubt amongst politicians, policy advisors and the public about how feasible and safe and secure this type of transition is. So we have to get those first pipelines up and running, as Renee said, and that's good, tangible evidence that in English idiom you can go and kick the tyres on the car and believe it works, and then you have confidence for investors. On the pipelines for hydrogen in the UK, then I think there's two types of pipeline there. We're fortunate in the UK that the gas distribution industry, the low pressure distribution around towns and cities and places where people live, has already renewed a lot of the metal pipes by polythene pipes, and they did that to reduce leakage and improve safety. But it turns out that it's widely claimed that those polythene pipes are instantaneously convertible to hydrogen. So that is part of the attraction for running hydrogen through the methane pipes and keeping that chemical energy flow.
Thank you. Can I come to the Australian, to Lee and Andrew, with another question now? Because one of the questions says, hydrogen transport to Europe from Australia are $2 per kilo. It's Australian dollar, I think I need to specify. Amazing vision, but would this require the same approach as LNG with dedicated vessels and infrastructure? JCB in the UK mentioned this yesterday. So I think it's a general question about it's not only to Europe, there's a plan to export probably to Japan as well from Australia, but still the transport issue of hydrogen is clearly an area of innovation, isn't it? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I'll let you go first with that one.
Andrew.
No worries. So it's great timing because this week the Australian government partnered with the German government and launched the outcomes of the High Supply project, which was exactly looking at that issue of the supply chain between Australia and Germany, and how can green molecules be exported from Australia and shipped to Germany. So just launched this week, and it is a big issue, especially when you're looking at liquefied hydrogen. But when you've got things like ammonia that are already able to be shipped and there's a physical market for it, that's probably the easier option. But I think it will end up very much similar to what the LNG market is today. Hydrogen will become a commodity in years to come, and if you do take a contract with a Woodside or a Santos or FFI, it doesn't necessarily mean the molecules will come from Australia. It will be a portfolio approach in years to come once the industry does get up. And that's where the importance of a market like Singapore and how you can connect the dots and bring in sort of some of these trading hubs to be part of a global solution. So I think you're spot on. It is a bit of a challenge for Australia, given we are so far away. But I think there's a lot of great relationships that have been built for many years through existing trading relationships from bilateral, also in the company space. So I think there's a lot of goodwill to solve some of those problems bilaterally, and leveraging the smarts that Germany and Australia both have, and how you can come to a great solution for both entities.
Andrew, anything to add, or you're satisfied with Lee?
Yeah, just a point of clarification. The $2 a kilo stretch target was production cost of hydrogen rather than the landed cost. So it's and the reason it's so low is to be able to look at that transport and delivery to our major markets at an affordable price.
On a similar topic, maybe we can touch on this one, but transport of CO2 as well is an element that come out to the discussion sometimes. The Acorn Project has an element of it, which is importing CO2. Yeah. Is there also a factor of complication or a technology innovation priority, or are we looking at CO2 storage from cluster only with less of a global or regional market?
I'm not an expert on CO2 shipping as such, but I will observe that CO2 shipping already occurs between the Yara fertilizer plant in Norway and into the UK. So we import industrial CO2 for use in food and drink industries. And so those tankers are at 3,000 and 10,000 tons. So you can run that middle-sized or small-sized fleet of tankers with existing technology, and that works. But if this was to become larger, then the calculations again suggest that there is a compromise between economy of size scale, getting bigger tankers, so that's cheaper per run, if you like, but also you need to get the tankers into quite small coastal locations often, so you don't want big super tankers with very deep ports. Those are in short supply. We have a very good deep water port in Peterhead, just to advertise that. So that's good for the import from anywhere. But round the North Sea, which will be the easiest place to start, I think the tankers will be this small size. And that will add a small amount of cost, but it's mainly the time spent loading and discharging would be the issue. Because I was interested in what the difference between the landed cost of hydrogen might be from Australia. If you guys can produce it in Australia for $2 a tonne Australian, are you going to add another 5 cents on to ship it to Europe, or is that another $1 to ship it to Europe? I have no real idea of that cost or of charging, so I don't know if anybody has yet.
I think there's definitely been some work done about that, but obviously it depends on the cost of your shipping ultimately. So, yeah, and the ships that you're going to build.
Yeah, we've done quite some work on that actually, as Rotterdam, as a major harbour for Northwest Europe, is anticipating importing large amounts of hydrogen. They're anticipating even up to 20 megaton, which is huge. Actually, it's 20 times the amount of hydrogen currently being used in the Netherlands, but they consider themselves also an import harbour for Germany and other regions in Northwest Europe. And then transporting hydrogen could be done in different ways. It could be as similar like LNG in a liquefied hydrogen form, but then you have to cool it down to 253 degrees, quite cool, unless you compress it. But there's other carriers like ammonia or liquid hydrogen, organic carriers that could bring it via ships to Rotterdam. Our estimates is actually, if you want to ship it from Australia to Rotterdam, you might add up $2, and I'm not sure if that's American or US, to the cost of the production of hydrogen. So it's actually transport of hydrogen is more expensive than transporting natural gas. So it really adds up to the total cost of bringing the hydrogen from the low cost production to the demand markets. So I think it's a serious competition with local production of hydrogen.
I also think that just like with LNG, we have to be aware of the embedded energy cost through compressing and cooling the LNG and reconverting that. The embedded energy in transporting hydrogen as hydrogen will be immense. So it's roughly, our calculations have been for LNG, it's something like 20 to 25% of the energy of the LNG is effectively wasted in compressing and transporting. And so it would be a pity if hydrogen ends up with the same sort of fate. But again, we can produce that locally, but it means that in Australia you're going to have to work even harder at producing that really low-cost hydrogen. And good luck with that, that would be terrific.
Thank you, Stuart. Julio, anything to add from Brazil on that?
Well, I was just thinking about what Stuart said a few minutes ago regarding that we have to start using the current infrastructure to transport CO2 and hydrogen. Is something very similar, well, of course, in a much smaller scale, the learning curve of the ethanol use in Brazil. Because the government at that time was a very centralized government, took action, but it took 30 years to have ethanol as a success in Brazil. And then I think the problem is very similar nowadays in terms of using the current infrastructure to transport hydrogen and CO2. We have to have governments and the will to start the projects, and then to start this learning curve that hopefully it will take not 30, 35 years, but less than that. Yeah, 5 years it would be the optimum number or something like that. And then to have a look in the learning curve of the ethanol case in Brazil, I think that's interesting nowadays, and to try to apply to the transport of CO2 and hydrogen.
And since you mentioned regulation, and of course we had the kickstart today with Andy Samuel from the regulator of the oil and gas industry, here's a question about that. So literally every country is now taking the cluster approach, not just for CCS, but also hydrogen and for wind areas. What kind of changes are needed to the way energy sector is regulated? Are we going back to a regional energy board approach? Who wants to take the first one?
You're looking at me, right? Well, I'm not very much.
I'm looking at the guys in Australia as well, but they don't see me looking at them. That's different, so you're picking it up.
An answer to that is that we have a very complicated system of government in the UK, where regions of the UK like Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales are separately administered for some things from England. So, for example, for the pore space for carbon dioxide injection and storage in water-filled bodies of rock, then we'd regulate that in Scotland. For injection and storage of CO2 in former gas fields or oil fields, that's retained by Westminster in London. So there are different regulators for different purposes. But overall, the UK has always tried to take a national view about regulating. So there's common standards, common approaches across the whole of the dispersed part of the UK. And that makes it a lot easier for industries and companies to develop, because if you have to negotiate effectively with individual cities or individual regions, and your project spans 3 or 4 different connections between that, you can forget it. Really, it's too complicated. So we have to have a national approach, I think.
And what's the perspective in Australia, guys? You know, the supercluster or the cluster you mentioned before, is that the change in regulations needed, or are you ready to go?
No, really we're in a very similar.
Yeah. Yep. Badly. Yeah. No, that's good.
You after you leave.
We're in a very similar situation to the UK, with states and territory governments having a huge role to play in regulating the development and the operation of, I guess, the emerging hydrogen industry. And we're very lucky that there is a lot of alignment between the national hydrogen strategy with the individual hydrogen strategies of each state and territory. And they're working really collaboratively to try and understand where are some real quick wins that need to be done to enable the industry to grow. So really understanding which are the time-sensitive issues that need to be approached versus what can be done in sort of 4 to 5 years down the track. So yeah, we have similar issues, but there is a really goodwill to get things going. And what we're seeing in our regional cluster network is that people are actually open and sharing. You know, we jump on a call once a month with the 15 regions, and you know, they're all sticking their hands up and saying, you know, we've got a challenge here. You know, where are some examples of what's been done in other states and territories, because it's not just the project proponents that are going through this, but it's the regions and the SMEs and the technology companies that are having to wade through this issue too. So yeah, it is complex, but I think we're getting through it.
Renee, what's the situation in the Netherlands? You know, you're working on the energy islands, a lot of a cluster concept there. Is it ready to go? Legislation or regulation, or changes are needed?
Also in the Netherlands, we see that the energy transition is much more focusing on cluster development, the cluster transition. Just to give an example on hydrogen, the northern part of the Netherlands is forming a hydrogen valley as a big cluster where hydrogen is being used in the not only in industry but also in mobility and in household applications to decarbonize. I mentioned Rotterdam, which is a big cluster of chemical industry, refining industry, but also an import harbor, and also a conversion park in the future for wind power to hydrogen. And also offshore, indeed, we think more and more into energy hubs and clusters where a combination of wind production, conversion, energy storage and CO2 storage will be combined in regions. And so the cluster approach is definitely a focus in the Netherlands. Now on regulations, a lot of the things that we think are needed in the future for energy transition are not yet allowed according to energy law. The hydrogen business is not yet a regulated business. It's left up to the market at the moment. So we have already commercial pipelines for hydrogen transport, even on CO2 transport. There is a national strategy, but if you want to admix hydrogen in the gas grid, it's not allowed by the Dutch gas law yet. If you want to electrify platforms to decarbonize, it's not allowed to deliver power offshore to assets. If you want to reuse depleted fields or platforms for other functions than oil and gas, it's not allowed by the Mining Act. So there's quite some regulation that has to be modified. But the government is heavily working on it to make it possible, because there is a national strategy on hydrogen, there's a national policy on CO2 storage, and there's an ongoing process to work on an integrated North Sea energy outlook for an integral approach to the role of the North Sea in the transition. So there's hard work ongoing, but we're not yet ready to go.
Yeah, fantastic. There's a fascinating discovery how much work is actually ongoing from a technology perspective. We're exploring this 2 days, but also from a legislation perspective. And the third part of the question, I think, is the people that was mentioned before, how to raise awareness and bring the people with us. I have two more questions for all of you. And one is, what are the biggest challenges that we can address better together? It's just the reason we're here. So what are we going to work together? What do you would like us to work together? Can I start with you, Giulio?
Well, the Brazilian case, I think we could start working together, but before, I think that the Brazilian case is completely different than even Australia, of course, UK, because in Brazil we have a completely different, well, it's not a uniform economy. And then if you think about legislation, Brazil is centralized in terms of oil production, not so centralized in terms of biofuel. And then the example of biofuel in Brazil is something that we could work together. NBS is something that we could work together very well. And because, for instance, in São Paulo State, where our center is based, São Paulo State is completely different than the rest of Brazil. If we were a country, it would be the 20th biggest economy. And then I think that biofuel is produced in São Paulo and some other states like Mato Grosso and Paraná. And we are very far apart from the Amazon forest. Burning the forest, that's a big problem that other countries must press Brazil to reduce the burning of the forest, is for pasture, not for biofuel production. And then I think that the example of biofuel, CCU is another example that I think could work together. And I believe that this third generation ethanol is something that could be exported to other countries. The technology that we are developing, SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuel as well, using this pure CO2 that comes from the fermentation in the process of production of ethanol. And those, and as Gustavo mentioned, the large-scale CO2 storage in the South Domes, very, well, offshore, but 300 kilometers from the Brazilian coast is something that Brazil, I believe that is going to be one of the leaders and could have a huge, very safe location to store CO2 is another possibility, and well, and so on. And I'm very happy to say that most of those topics we are working in our center, our CGI. That's good for us.
Thank you. And Stuart, what can we work together with Brazil, with Australia, with the Netherlands, and of course with the Americans and Canadians that are part of our conversation we were here yesterday?
Okay. Well, I guess for me there's three things. So the first thing is to do exactly the sort of thing we're doing today, to share experiences and to share where we are in the mission and the journey, so we don't have to keep reinventing how to do things on different continents. So that's the sort of science and technology interaction that I'm well used to, international trading in that way. And then the second type of thing is, I think we also need to work on, can we have international standards and internationally accepted ways of doing CO2 transport, for example, so that the flanges on the boat fit the flanges on the shore when you get to Norway or get to Brazil or whatever it is. So international compatibility. And I think the other big thing, the last big thing, is to try and get this out of the hands of government as soon as possible and into the hands of commercial industries to make this proper business as usual, because at the moment all these developments are really grant funded and special funded and government funded by 50%, 70% or whatever. So and that takes a long time. It tends to be very expensive because companies tend to ask for the maximum possible grant, and therefore it tends to be really, really slow, because certainly in this country the government wants to know how many nuts and bolts and how many tea bags you've used, and really we just need to make this much more aligned with the established energy and oil and gas business, so people can, because we need projects to be scaled up by not just a factor of 5 or 10, but literally a factor of 30 or 100 times faster than we're doing at the moment.
Thank you. And Renee, I'll come to you next, and then Andrew and Lee. You know, what are the priorities for us to work together?
Yeah, I support some of the statements that were made. Indeed, there's the need for international standards and sharing best practices and knowledge. That's always great and very important, I think, to accelerate. I think what is also needed before the market will take up all these type of initiatives on CO2 and hydrogen is we're building completely new value chains, right? With new partners who didn't work with one another in the past. Think about oil and gas companies now have to work with renewable energy companies and industry to build a new value chains on hydrogen sourced from renewable power and then fed to industry or mobility or households. And they need to have some trust that this market will evolve, that there will be the right market incentives, that there's the right value for the hydrogen produced and the CO2 to be stored. And on the other hand, there is a security of supply by the industry who wants to change, to decarbonize with hydrogen or capture CO2. So there has to be some trust that this value chain will work, that the infrastructure will be there, and that the incentives are there to build this value chain and have security of supply on the long term. And then the industry will be willing to invest in these change, I think. And that needs also support from government on clear policies and long-term security and objectives to make it happen. And of course, from the Knowledge Institute side, we need to set up this international collaborations. Together with NZTC, indeed, Luca, we're already working on the One North Sea program, where we want to collaborate with different institutes and countries around the North Sea on all these challenges that we jointly have on CCS and on hydrogen and on electrification. And I think that's the first step, but we should do this, of course, globally as well.
Thank you. And Australia, what do you want to work together with us?
I think there's a really good opportunity to share of course, are individual learnings between each country and each area. I think there's the best practice that Renee talked about, but also the pitfalls. I think that's really important to identify those for each other. And each of those jurisdictions, those geographical areas that we work in, have different contexts to them and have slightly different drivers to them. So I think through those different collaborations that we have, we'll be able to share those slightly different approaches at doing things with each other, and that might spur on different development pathways for us all.
Thanks, Andrew. And being the last one, it's a bit hard because they've all said all the great inputs. But from my point of view, it's really how we leverage existing platforms and frameworks. So you've got mission innovation at the government level. You've got industry partnerships like net zero tech centres facilitating here today. So how do you join these two up and really not duplicate, create those efficiencies and provide those international linkages and collaborations for the SMEs and technology companies that are in all of our different markets to solve the challenges that are across the world, whether it be in CCS or hydrogen transport has been brought up tonight. So how do you actually join these really super smart people around the world who are trying to solve complex problems and ensure that they are collaborating and reducing any duplication and trying to obviously save time. That's probably the one thing we don't have on our side. So how we can actually facilitate those connections, I think, is something that everyone in these tech centres, that's really one of our key mandates.
And we'll touch about that tomorrow, of course. So last question for me, and we go in reverse order. So Lee, you're the first now, and Julie will be the last. So it's day 2 of COP. What do you hope to see in the next 2 weeks, in 1 or 2 sentences max? Lee, first.
Wow, thank you. So for me, it's really around that increased collaboration and bringing everyone up. We're all in this together. So again, how do you collaborate amongst each other to solve global problems? The expertise might be sitting in a different country. How do you make it really open, transparent, and inviting to bring different technologies around the world?
Andrew?
From my point of view, I'd like to see that we move away from some of this divisive rhetoric, and we come together to all. We've got an emissions challenge. We've got to really go for it with every single technology that we can get our hands on, and come to a global solution that will really drive down as fast as possible those emissions. It really does, from my point of view. Doesn't matter where the technology, what the technology is, as long as we're driving that emissions down as fast as we can.
Renee, what do you expect from COP26?
Yeah, for me, it's extremely important that all the great ambitions and stories transfer into actions and projects. I think many of the technologies that we are discussing are actually already there. We just have to implement them and make sure that governmental policies are in place to have industry investing in these projects, and we start demonstrating that this can really work and put an example to the rest of the world how it can be done. Because I think technically it can be done, and if we bring ambition into action, then we could all realize our originally Paris ambitions.
Stuart, your hope for COP26 outcomes?
So I'm focused on the larger scale, I guess. So I would hope for the nationally determined contributions multiply by a factor of 5 or something, because heading for 2.7 or 3 degrees is just still suicide. And we'll be spending more and more of our effort, political time and money on fixing the storms and fixing the damage rather than getting on with solving the problems. So we have to actually get the political people to reduce that, to improve that. I think all our technological, scientific engineering conversations will carry on. Now we've invented proper video conferencing. This is a huge step forward, and I don't have to spend half my life traveling around, and that you know, this makes communication better and faster, so continue with that, but we have to advise all the representatives to actually commit with numbers, not just vague words that it would be nice to do net zero. We actually have to have some real numbers and real dates.
It reduces our emissions too by having the conference this way, isn't it?
Yeah, this is good.
Giulio, you're hopeful to COP26.
Yeah, well, I'm in a very comfortable position now that I'm the last one. Well, and then for me, it's what has already been said. The NDCs must be multiplied by 5 and translated into actions and new projects. And now I think that's what I really hope of COP26.
Thank you, and thank you for all of the speakers and the panelists. It's been another fascinating day in this journey around the world and towards net zero. Join us tomorrow at 12 noon UK time. That's the final part. That's where we wrap up, draw the conclusion, understand a bit more the commonality and the differences, but also where we discuss what do we do next. And with that, I'd really like to just thank our speakers, but to thank the team in the background that made it work seamlessly, including this hybrid conference, as you mentioned, Stuart. And of course, the audience here in the room. Is great to see real-life people in 3D after so long. But also, of course, all the people that have been following us on the Hopin platform and on LinkedIn, and I know there are many. And I hope to see you all again tomorrow at 12 noon UK time here. That's all for today. Thank you very much.
Hello, I am delighted to be introducing the Net Zero Technology Centre's Virtual Technology Showcase today. By co-investing with industry and working in partnership with the public and private sectors, we are funding R&D and driving investment to develop and deploy technology for a net zero North Sea. Innovative, game-changing technology developers are disrupting the energy sector as we know it, and we at the Net Zero Technology Centre are delighted to support their efforts, helping to advance their ideas from spark to concept, concept to trial, and trial to commercialisation.